this morning. Our next speaker is an assistant professor of philosophy of education at the UP College of Education. She earned her bachelor's degree in philosophy from CSSP and her master's degree in teaching in the early grades from the UP College of Education in 2013. Currently, our speaker is a PhD student of educational history and philosophy at the UP College of Education. Her research interests include philosophy for slash with children, the development of critical, creative, and caring thinking, education for democracy, and the implementation of the community of inquiry in basic and higher education. Let's all please welcome Professor Abigail Thea O. Canuto. Good morning, ma'am. Good morning,
Good
ma'am
morning.
Abby.
Good morning, Ma'am Lay. Good morning, everyone. May sharing, may share screen powers na rin po ba ako? It looks like it. Okay. Kita po?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so we'll begin, ano? Thank you so much again, Ms. Lay, for the introduction. Sir Totoy, Ma'am Tess, and the rest of the Community of Inquiry team, and to all our participants, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. So, marami na pong nabanggit about the Community of Inquiry, and I think I can speak on behalf of my fellow P4C practitioners or Community of Inquiry practitioners. Mas sanay kami sa face-to-face setup, katulad po ng lahat siguro ng participants natin. We as teachers have also been forced to deliver instruction remotely. Okay, so whether we like it or not, wala talaga tayong choice because of the pandemic. But like what Sir Totoy has been mentioning, this is a really good opportunity to look into gaps in research, for example, in education as a whole, di ba? I think we've reached a point when we can no longer treat remote learning as an emergency measure. In the beginning, yun talaga siya, emergency yung ginagawa natin. In other words, para makatawid lang sa krisis. Pero di natin alam, unfortunately, kung kailan po tayo ganito. So we're doing our part. I'm trying to look into how to just in fact do that, how to foster communities of inquiry in distance learning. Okay, so we might be using terms interchangeably here. We can talk about distance learning, remote learning, online learning also. Ito pong presentation ko naka-contextualize sa online learning. But of course, we were not saying that a community of inquiry, at least to some extent, cannot be established even when we have a number of students who don't really have good internet connection, for example, kasi katulad na mababanggit ko po later, hindi yun maiiwasan. So again, I'm Assistant Professor Abigail Thea Canuto from the UP College of Education. I also came from the UP Department of Philosophy as a student. I graduated there, but I'm now with the UP College of Education as faculty. So just so you could follow my train of thought, we're going to begin by talking about the importance of distance, yet still collaborative learning. Okay, so collaborative learning is something that's, I'm assuming, familiar to most, if not all of us, especially those of us who are practicing teachers. So we're going to contextualize the notion of collaborative learning to the community of inquiry, okay? Just a bit of an operationalization of how we do it face-to-face. And then we're going to look at the wisdom of Garrison et al. And look at the three presences, yung tinatawag niyang three presences. Nabanggit din po kanina ni Dr. Mendoza. We're going to contextualize the community of inquiry now to distance learning. And then finally, I'm going to zero in on the importance of the teacher as facilitator. Okay, so one of the three presences, for example, is the teaching presence. And that really points towards the importance, the indispensability of the role of the teacher as facilitator in making this community of inquiry work. So it begins with us, in other words, as teachers. Okay, so why is collaborative learning? Why do we need to insist on collaborative learning despite the distance? Again, as I'm assuming we are all familiar, di ba? This crisis has affected and will continue to affect us all. kahit may vaccine may vaccines na in the horizon. But we will eventually need to adapt to these new circumstances. And webinars like this, I think, very good opportunity, for us to work towards that adaptation. We believe po as teachers that we will have a greater chance at succeeding in adapting to these new circumstances if we forge a sense of belonging and connectedness despite the physical distance among us. So ang tinutumbo ko po dito ay, although may mga thinking skills, for example, obviously na targeted in the community of inquiry, being in a community itself, on a social emotional level, is, I think, fundamental to effective learning. Ganon din on the part of teachers, yung sinasabi rin kanina ni Dr. Mendoza, no? How comforting, for example, it is to be, in the company of quote-unquote friends. And the community of inquiry provides us with that possibility, to forge, friendship that is to, I think, a good degree, genuine. I'll get to that later on. Siyempre, proseso po yun, pero dahil nga wala tayong choice, we're delivering learning remotely now, importante pa rin itong element na ito in education. So, again, I'm assuming you're all familiar, collaborative learning is basically characterized by a classroom where students and teacher have a common goal or work towards a common goal. This is where group members, that includes the teacher, coordinate their cognitive, metacognitive, motivational, and emotional efforts. Obviously, easier said than done, but at the least, operational definition, we know where we're at. We also, think of collaborative learning as an ideal kind of learning because they're an active exchange of ideas that result in, literature says, increased interest, generally speaking, improved thinking, and a more relaxed atmosphere. And at the end of the day, siguro kung magiging successful po tayo doon sa pag-cultivate ng genuine collaborative learning, we don't have to worry so much or as much as concerns that have to do with, students cheating, katulad ng mga tanong ni Dr. Payongayong, hindi ba? Kaya din naman tayo natatakot or hindi komportable doon sa setup na ito kasi parang feeling natin as teachers, wala tayong masyadong control sa ginagawa ng mga estudyante natin. And katulad ng mga nakikita natin recently, we've seen or see with our own students, some of them, are not really as engaged or not really as invested in the process, and some of them might even treat distance learning as an opportunity to not do their responsibilities or not accomplish their responsibilities as students. So, ang hinahanap po kasi natin is to confront, ways by which we can confront all of these challenges. I would say that, to a great degree, there is some faith that needs to be placed upon students and upon ourselves also. While we're understanding what our limitations are, dapat malinaw pa rin po sa atin palagi kung ano yung pinaka-objective natin as teachers. And that begins by acknowledging, embracing, and again, courageously confronting these challenges to collaborative learning. We need to understand that collaborative learning does not happen automatically. It happens only with intention, persistent intention. We know that successful regulation is not always observed in group learning, for example. Learners in groups do not always share common goals, plans, strategies, and teacher facilitation is tend to interpretation. As I always tell my students or colleagues, when we talk about facilitation, it's something na medyo gas-gas na nga in education, hindi ba? We often hear that word, we often use it, and facilitation, in other words, can be defined very loosely, which is all right. There's really not one definition of facilitation anyway. But in the context of the community of inquiry, kailangan po malinaw sa atin exactly what facilitation means. So we'll explore that further as we go along. So alam natin na mahirap ang collaborative learning. In face-to-face setup, a lot of teachers would actually do away with it because of, so many challenges already in place, more fundamental challenges, I would say. But what about lalong-lalo na po ngayon, in the middle of a pandemic? Is there a point at all in even insisting on collaborative learning? Alam natin, for example, that students and teachers are all affected one way or another by the pandemic. Walang exempted. Kahit ang pinakamayayaman, sila siguro less affected, pero nevertheless, meron pa ring effect sa kanila ang pandemic. This crisis exacerbates, unfortunately, the conditions of those with limited resources. So it's a problem really when we have students with limited resources, or tayo mismo, hindi ba, limited yung resources natin dahil talagang nagde-demand po ang distance learning ng resources. There remains much discomfort as well with and resistance towards distance learning. And this is not something that we can blame students or teachers for. Very seldom can we find schools, teachers, administrators who can truly say na prepared sila for the shift. Talagang gulatan yung nangyari sa atin. Hindi ba? At isang taon na nga natin itong na-experience. At hanggang ngayon, hindi pa rin tayo sanay sa ganitong setup, talking to your screen, looking at, at your screen all day. And so yung Zoom fatigue, as I think was mentioned earlier this morning, still very real. Many teachers have also claimed that it's very difficult to establish social presence, which is the foundation of the community of inquiry, or even just rapport, even online, di ba? May mga instances, kadalasan, maswerte ka na kung may isa o dalawa kang estudyante na magpapakita. Di ba? All the time, patay yung screens nila. And while you understand that, we have our own respective situations, and some students or teachers might not be comfortable exposing, di ba, their home, for example, in Zoom, and therefore we cannot coerce members of the class to keep their videos on all the time. It again exacerbates the situation of distance learning, lalong nagiging distance because you can't even see your interlocutors. Hindi mo nakikita yung mga kausap mo. But all of these things, we need to believe that we can surpass, at least, as we go along, might not be immediately. What we need to always keep in mind is that first and foremost, the objective is to provide the space to discuss what our problems are and what we need to do about them. This needs to be qualified though, because the community of inquiry naman po is not, just a venue for therapy. Hindi lang din naman siya opportunity para magkwentuhan, although maaaring kasama yun. But the community of inquiry, let me emphasize, this is an academic environment also. So there's really a focus on the development of thinking skills. So kahit na may nagkakwentuhan, drawing from experiences, the teacher needs to be able to invite students to qualify their answers, further reflect on their answer, problematize examples, and so on. Sige, mababanggit pa naman po ang lahat ng ito as we go along. So, to be clear, the space that needs to be provided rather, is one where students and teachers can ask one another questions about what they are going through. Doesn't have to be very, to be on a very personal level, what they are going through in general. To share their thoughts and feelings with one another, not just because it is potentially therapeutic, I said, but because it is a way to build trust, forge camaraderie, and think and act as a community. Importante po kasi ito, prerequisite ito, before we can even think out a classroom that thinks together. They need to be comfortable muna with each other. They need to, invest their trust, for example, muna, that they will not be ridiculed for what they say, that they will not be laughed at, halimbawa, when their ideas aren't too typical. Okay, something like that. So the community of inquiry was initially conceptualized, as pedagogy by Lippmann, I mean, in face-to-face classroom. So, it was a time when we could not yet imagine that we would need to do this remotely. So, simply put, okay, the community of inquiry is made up of a group of individuals inquiring into a specific problem or issue. So, napakasimple lang ng kanyang definition, ano? A group of individuals inquiring into a specific problem or issue. The community of inquiry is a community when the students and the teacher are guided by a common interest. Okay, and that's why it cannot be, like just a session on therapy where just one student monopolizes, for example, the whole discussion. It needs to be, as I will mention later, dialogical. Multiple students, if not all students, contribute, to the conversation. It's also harmonious. Okay, again, there's a friendly vibe. There is a climate of camaraderie. So, pag-uusapan pa po natin ito in a while. It's called a community of inquiry naman because it's guided by thinking, reasoning, and asking questions. So, pedagogically speaking, therefore, a community of inquiry becomes a community of inquiry when students start to ask questions. Asking questions, therefore, is central to the community of inquiry. And taken together, a community of inquiry is a community of inquiry because student, teacher, and the teacher think together. What are the sorts of things that they think about? Anything under the sun, wala po, sky's the limit, okay? For as long as we can problematize them. And so, there are some examples there, as you can see in the screen. Yung mga examples po na yan, I framed based on the content areas. So there are math questions that are not necessarily objectively answered. Ganun din sa ethics, values education or moral education. Ganun din sa science. In other words, may mga problematic questions, interesting questions that can be asked regardless of the content or subject area. Okay, so the community of inquiry is a space where we can talk about those questions and we can talk about possible answers to those questions. Bakit ganito yung mga tanong sa community of inquiry? Dahil ang nangyayari po sa community of inquiry is philosophical thinking and speaking or philosophical talking. Okay? Mas philosophical ang mga tanong na hinahandle sa community of inquiry. So, katulad ng sinabi ko, importante po that the kind of discourse is dialogical or a dialogue. And it might be easy to say now we are already doing this for as long as questions are asked, for example, or for as long as multiple students speak in the course of, let's say, an hour and a half. Pero alalahanin po natin na may iba't ibang uri ng discourse. Discussion, for example, is the most typical, and this takes the least effort from the facilitator. So there is always that tendency that the community of inquiry is not a community of inquiry in that students merely discuss. Informally, it's a conversation lang. Parang ganon, walang forward movement, walang tinutumbok, walang pagpo-problematize. So here, in a discussion, what often happens is that you just have anecdotes being shared without structure, without direction, again. The boundaries therefore are clearer. Katulad sa dialogical inquiry or sa dialogue, maaaring manganak yung tanong. At yung sa panganganak ng mga tanong, nagiging mas komplikado ang mga tanong pero mas nagiging malalim. And in that process, I hope you can imagine at this point, mas nagiging critical at reflective ang mga estudyante. A debate, on the other hand, that discussion can actually pursue that direction kung ang facilitation ng teacher ay pinagtutunggan niya ang mga sagot for the sake of, these answers competing with each other. So competitive po ang debate. Although I'm not saying that discussions or debates are not productive in other respects, but in the community of inquiry, kailangan po talaga dialogical. Okay, so in dialogue, we are not debating, we are not merely discussing, but it's collaborative. Okay, participants contribute to the discussion, and the teacher facilitates so that these contributions make sense at the end of the day. The teacher therefore makes sure that relevant points are organized, during the dialogue or during the discourse. So it's focused towards a forward movement. Now, how do we now that remotely or in distance learning? Garrison and his associates help us out. They have a framework, the community of inquiry framework, that they apply in online learning. Although what's interesting to point out is that there's really, at least at the moment, no established method as to how exactly, to form or to foster communities of inquiry in distance learning. In other words, yung framework po kasi ni Garrison is a way for us to assess or evaluate the extent to which communitarian ang ating mga klase online. Iba pa pong usapin yung tanong ng how to. So when I was asked to deliver this talk, I made it very clear na wala pa talagang strictly speaking, instruction sa atin exactly kung paano ito gagawin. So what we can do, at least for now, is to build from our experiences in face-to-face setup and then conceptualize how possibly the three presences can be established in the community inquiry, online or in distance learning. So ito lang po yung framework ni Garrison et al. Okay? So you can see there the three presences: social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. So siguro po, kahit maaga pa pwede ko nang sabihin dahil nabanggit na rin kanina, these presences actually overlap. Okay? The reason why they are distinct here, halimbawa in this framework, is that there are particular elements in these presences that are specific to those particular presences. But as they work, as they operate in the community of inquiry, hindi talaga po sila hiwalay na hiwalay. Okay, papaliwanag ko pa po yun as we go along. So social presence, first and foremost, one indicator of social presence is open communication. Okay, so it's when the group feels secure to communicate openly and coalesces around a common goal or purpose. So the teacher helps in that way kasi kailangan i-direct. Kung halimbawang may dalawang tanong kaagad na seemingly hindi related, kailangan ma-relate siya ng teacher, mahanapan niya ng relasyon, o kung talagang hindi related ang dalawang tanong or ang dalawang insight, pili mo na siya siguro ng maaaring mas fundamental at yun ang direksyon na tatahakin. Okay, another element is group cohesion. It's when, students are now guided by mutual respect and intellectual focus. So, ang isang problema na maaaring naisip lamang ng isang estudyante through the teacher's facilitation, naiintindihan ng mga estudyante, ng iba pang mga estudyante kung bakit concerned din nila yung problema na yon, halimbawa. And they therefore focus attention on pursuing that one problem, and then therefore it becomes a common goal. Affective expression is another one. It happens when participants have found affinity in the group. It's when they start to address one another spontaneously. It's when they are more and more invested in contributing to the discussion and so on. So some tips, there are a lot, but I think these are some of the most used, at least in the beginning. So it can help if you create a discussion forum. So, in the beginning, we make it a point to introduce ourselves, provide some personal information, just so, some rapport is built. Okay? So, siguro mas may responsibilidad tayong i-on ang camera natin to begin with. Okay? Because again, it's very, very hard to trust, the Zoom class, for example, when you can't even see your teacher or you can't even see your classmates, let's say. It's also important that we address class participants in the discussion by name. And once the first and the second points are done, all the time, ito na po yung gagawin natin. Just encourage students to speak. In bold po, encourage. Big sabihin, let's not force naman students to speak. Okay? So even just our demeanor, halimbawa when we speak in our class, our general atmosphere, na pinoproject sa screen, halimbawa, can already be encouraging. Hindi po to necessarily literally, sige na magsalita na ko, or paulit-ulit tayo na, di ba, sino na ang pwede magsalita? It takes patience also on our part. So typically, ito po yung process ng pag-establish ng social presence. Hindi po ito nangyayari kaagad. Nagsisimula ito sa online acquaintances muna. So kahit na alam natin sa sarili natin, malinaw po sa atin that our objective is to create communities of inquiry, let us be realistic and understand that it does not happen right away. It means, again, ito muna, online acquaintances. Ganon din naman po sa face-to-face, ano? Tapos magkakaroon ng conferment. May identification na sila, halimbawa na ito kaklase ko, ito ang teacher ko, I'm a member of this class. Social presence is successfully established when, again, there's already camaraderie. So may proseso po ito. Hindi ito nangyayari kaagad. A strong social presence builds a climate of trust and environment of comfort and safe risk-taking. Which basically means that we cannot take this for granted. This foundation makes the learners ready for your teaching presence and cognitive presence. Cognitive presence is the second presence. It is the extent to which learners are able to construct and confirm meaning through sustained reflection and discourse. Sustained reflection and discourse. So as a facilitator, in your mind, you always need to be very clear about your ultimate objective. Again, to have students think reflectively, to think critically. That is ultimately the intended outcome. According to literature, it is the most difficult to develop in online courses. Kasi una, may challenge ka na kagad sa social presence. But mind you, sa face-to-face din po, I think, totoo din ito. Hindi din kaagad critically or reflectively thinking ang mga estudyante. Cognitive presence begins with the triggering event. So this is basically laying down now the process of the dialogue. It begins with a problematic question. In the beginning, sa simula ng semestre or ng school year, maaaring ang teacher ang nagtatanong or nagbibigay ng isang puzzling na idea. It be followed by exploration or information exchange. And then integration happens when you're now facilitating many different insights from many different students. And then it should end with a resolution of some sort, where ideas are applied. It does not necessarily mean that it's applied concretely, okay? But conclusions need to be formed, is what I'm saying, kahit na po on a theoretical level lamang. Resolution din pong matatawag yung meron pang further questions that remain. Cognitive presence includes activities developed and actions taken to encourage students to explore their ideas, thoughts, and beliefs to meaningfully connect with the content and facilitate learning. So ito po ulit ang process ng establish ng cognitive presence. May 4. At ito po ay magsaspan siguro isang oras, maaaring lagpas. Depende sa mga estudyante, syempre. Teaching presence is the design, on the other hand, facilitation and direction of cognitive and social processes for the purpose of realizing personally meaningful and educationally worthwhile learning outcomes. In other words, daling salita, ito po ang ginagawa lahat ng ginagawa ng teacher. It is manifested in everything the instructor does. So it's important that we are clear with ourselves exactly what the role is of the facilitator in the community of inquiry. And it might help us track the progress of our community of inquiry when we understand that there are different stages. Daniel et al. Calls these types of verbal exchanges So simula po natural lang na magsisimula sa kwentuhan lamang katulad ng nabanggit ko. Ito po ang description sa bandang kanan. Wala pang structure. Basta opinion ko, yun ang tama, yun ang conclusion. It is the challenge of the facilitator to therefore transition from one type of verbal exchange to the next. Monological is when wala pa ring interdependence ang mga estudyante, but parang nagigets na po nila, naiintindihan na nila paunti-unti na may sinusundan silang iisang direksyon. Non-critical dialogical is when you can now see the beginnings of a community of inquiry. There are more spontaneous sharing of answers, but thinking habits are not yet internalized, meaning the teacher is still facilitating very actively. The teacher still prods frequently. And then the facilitator now starts to relinquish control of the COI once it has become a semi-critical dialogical. So there is greater interdependence. But the influence is not enough to modify the whole group's perspective. We're not saying that that's the objective. Ang sinasabi lang po natin, meron pa rin mga hindi nagko-coalesce doon sa common goal ng group. Critical dialogical is basically the community of inquiry. So it depends, kung gaano katagal ang tinitake ng bawat klase. Iba-iba po, pero typically ito po ang proseso. So the teacher as facilitator, I think, is very important to emphasize kasi ito yung magde-determine, katulad ng sinabi ko, ng success ng community of inquiry to a great degree. Okay, so drawing from a paper that I wrote and also from Garrison et al., it's important that the teacher has a bird's eye view. So, very simply put, we need to be able, even in the beginning pa lang, to make students welcome and safe. We need to be able to cultivate trust, respect, and fairness in class. At paulit-ulit po natin itong gagawin, hindi lang sa simula. Social presence is established when students have acquired the ability to project themselves socially and emotionally. This will begin with us. It's important to maintain a keen intuition, lalo na sa Zoom, mas lalo na dahil hindi nga natin nakikita ng mga estudyante natin. So when they speak, let's truly listen to their ideas. We don't listen only to respond. We don't listen and then, start to prepare ourselves for the next idea. We should be able to detect or feel readiness and reluctance kasi minsan po talaga hindi pa sila ready mag-share. And that's okay. Okay? Pero talagang komplikadong pagtitimpla, pagtatansya ang ginagawa ng teacher kung pwede na ba siyang, kung pwede na ba siyang magtawag o mas mag-urge sa mga estudyante magsalita. Makes reasonable tentative predictions where the dialogue may be heading. So although ayaw mong unahan ng mga estudyante sa sinasabi nila, there is also some reasonable prediction that is being done. Hindi ka pwedeng maiwan ng mga estudyante sa dialogue na paano tayo nakarating sa idea na ito or paano ko ba ito i-connect? Parang ganon. Dapat meron tayong foresight, okay? Sa maaaring maging problema pa. Mga 2 steps ahead tayo sa mga estudyante siguro. Ganun. And of course, the teacher herself or himself needs to stay committed to inquiry. Again, always in mind what the community of inquiry is, what it is for, and how to get there. Always examine, challenge, and probe student responses, thereby encouraging analysis or ideas, katulad ng ginagawa ni Socrates. And that's why the Socratic Dialogue. Supervise the development of the community and reduce or eliminate alienation among the participants. Kasi once ma-alienate na yung mga estudyante, ma-feel na nila na hindi pala welcome talaga yung idea ko, magsha-shutdown na sila. At mahirap ibalik yung trust na yun. Consciously work towards the critical dialogical type of exchange. Now, this might not always happen, unfortunately. Maaring, lalo na po sa kaso ko, halimbawa, isang SEM lamang ang experience ko with students, that's about 4 months, tama ba? 16 weeks on the average. Hindi palaging nakakarating dito, pero alam mo na yun yung goal, at the least, makarating man lang sila sa semi-critical dialogical type of exchange. So kung isang taon niyo po sila kasama, mas dapat yata na marating ninyo yung critical dialogical type of exchange. So like was mentioned earlier, emerging research suggests a complementary relationship between teaching and cognitive presence. Social presence lays the groundwork for higher level discourse, and the structure, organization, and leadership associated with teaching presence creates the environment where cognitive presence can be developed. And in a critical dialogical type of exchange, meaning kapag totoong community of inquiry na po sila, talagang mas melded together na yung mga presences. Thank you so much again for having me this morning. Sana kahit pa paano may napulot tayo, and together, I hope we will get through this. Salamat po.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for that very informative discussion